you can actually see the board. Yeah, we see the board now. Perfect. And I'm going to get it closer so you can actually hear me this time. Perfect. All right, guys, you guys ready? All right, so today we're learning about cellular respiration. All right. What is that? Cellular respiration is the process of making ATP. Okay, it's the process of making ATP. And how do we make ATP? Well, we need certain things. We need certain reagents to make ATP. You guys know how you have to eat sugars and fats in your diet, right? Mm-hmm. You eat sugars and fats for energy, right? Mm-hmm. That's exactly what we're getting. We're getting sugars, we're getting fats. Mainly we're going to talk about sugars like glucose today, how glucose becomes, that energy gets harvested to make ATP. Does that make sense? So what organelle comes to mind when you're thinking about ATP production? Mitochondria, right? Exactly. So we're talking about the mitochondria. Well, actually, hold on. Let me draw a cell. So if I have a cell, right? This is a cell. It has a nucleus, right? It also has mitochondria, right? This is the mitochondria. All right, and remember the mitochondria has an outer membrane, and then it has a convoluted or highly folded inner membrane. So you got the outer membrane, you've got the inner membrane, and then you've got intermembrane space, right? The space between the two membranes is the intermembrane space, right? And what's the fluid in the very middle called? Matrix, right? Matrix. Okay, so that's a mitochondria. I just want to make sure we actually see all this. Maybe it's cut off a little bit. Okay. There we go. Now we see everything. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. We're talking about the mitochondria, right? That's where the ATP is being made, most of it, right? Mitochondria. So that's why I drew this. Okay? You know what we're going to do? You see this little box I'm drawing here? Is that little box? That little box has the outer membrane and the inner membrane in the box. Does that make sense? Let's zoom in on the box. Like we have a microscope. We're going into that box. Make sense? We're going to look right in there. So that's why I drew this. Look. Look at this. You see what happened? This membrane is which membrane? Outer. This is the outer membrane of the mitochondria. Does that make sense? This would be the inner membrane of the mitochondria. This space in the middle is the intermembrane space. That's right. Intermembrane space. Good. Perfect. That means, what is this down here? Matrix, right? Matrix. So do you see what I did? I'm just zooming in on this mitochondria so we can see the membranes clearly, right? Does that make sense? And what's this out here? Cytoplasm, right? Cytoplasm. Right, so because that's outside, that's here, right? That's outside of the mitochondria, isn't it? Okay, so the way I'm going to explain cellular respiration is unlike anyone else how they explain cellular respiration. This is my own way of explaining cellular respiration. I didn't learn it this way. I didn't find it this way online. No one showed me this way. But I honestly think this is the best way to teach it. And the way I'm going to teach it is from the end, from the very end. I'm not going to start at the beginning with the sugar, you see? I'm not starting at the sugar. I'm starting at the very, very, very end. And you'll see why later. It'll make sense why later. Does that make sense? All right. So at the very end, you've got the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Okay? And look what's inside of the inner membrane of the mitochondria. I did warn you guys that I'll be erasing some.
Protein.
Yeah, it's a transmembrane protein complex, okay?
Yeah.
It's a transmembrane protein complex. Transmembrane protein complex. What does protein complex mean? It means this is not one protein. It's actually many proteins in a quaternary structure. Does that make sense? It's a big complex, but it's a transmembrane protein complex, right? And which membrane is this in? The inner membrane of the mitochondria. The inner membrane of the mitochondria has a transmembrane protein complex, okay? And this thing is awesome, okay? This protein complex here is like a little motor. It behaves like a small motor, and not just any motor, a rotary motor, you know, a motor that spins. Here's how it works, ready? The top part here I drew, the top part literally spins, okay? The top part literally spins. Like a motor. And the bottom part, when the top part spins, that powers the bottom part to do this. The bottom part is an enzyme, and it takes ADP. What's ADP? What does that mean? Adenosine diphosphate. Two phosphate groups, right? ADP. And it also takes P, right? A phosphate group, but it's called PI. Why is it called PI?
Inorganic.
Inorganic phosphate. You know what that means? It just means that the phosphate group is just a phosphate group. It's not attached to anything that has a carbon in it. That means inorganic phosphate. Does that make sense? So you take P, you take ADP plus P equals TP, right? ATP. Can you see that? If you take ADP plus P, you got ATP.
Yeah.
There you go. That's how you make ATP, right? This awesome little enzyme that lives in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, it spins and it produces ATP. It's like a little motor. And it makes 28 ATP this way from one glucose, you see? One glucose, you get 28 of these ATP, but is that all of the ATP that we're going to make during this process?
No.
No, eukaryotes net 30 ATP, prokaryotes net 32. So almost all of the ATP that we're going to make from a glucose, almost all of it's made by this guy that spins and makes ATP. Now you're going to make a few more here and there, but that's not the main point, right? Does that make sense? The main point is, this is the machine that makes the lion's share, the big share of the ATP. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So the top part spins, the bottom part spits out ATP, right? Produces ATP. And do you know what this enzyme is called? It's the ATP synthesizing enzyme. Or it's called ATP synthase. ATP synthase.
Oh, that's the enzyme.
That's the enzyme. It's called ATP synthase. ATP synthesizing enzyme. ACE means enzyme. It's the ATP synthesizing enzyme. ATP synthase. And it's a transmembrane protein complex enzyme that's in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. The top part literally spins. The bottom part produces ATP. And most of the ATP during cellular respiration, most of it is made right there, right then, like that. And that's the end of the story. That's the end of the story. We're done. I told you we're going to start at the very end of the story. Does that make sense, though, how that works? Anyone confused about that at all? So you've been hearing your whole life, you know, not your whole life, but during grade school, you're like, mitochondria is the powerhouse, it makes ATP. Now you know why. In the mitochondria, in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, is this very powerful motor. It's an enzyme that spins, called ATP synthase, and it literally puts a phosphate group on ADP to make ATP. That's what it literally does. And it makes 28 ATP per glucose this way. Yes?
But normally the ATP that's breaking down to the ADP. Right now the ADP
Yeah.
to the P
Normally,
to the A.
exactly. Normally when the cell wants to do something, and it needs ATP, it'll take ATP, hydrolyze it to ADP and P.
Yeah.
That releases a bunch of
Release.
energy that you can energy couple and do that work, right? But now you have the ADP and the P, well now this allows you to recycle it. This
Oh,
allows you to
okay.
make more ATP so you can do more things in the cell that require energy.
Okay, that will be recycled.
It'll be recycled, yeah. So this ATP will go into the rest of the cell and the cell will use it to do whatever it wants to do that requires energy, right? Does that make sense? And then it'll break it down again and then it'll come back to the mitochondria again and they'll be joined again. So it's like reusable stuff, right? It's like if you have those rechargeable batteries, you use the battery, you use up the charge and you recharge it. You know, this is the recharger, right? Does that make sense? So if we're working backwards, this is the end of the story. We're working backwards toward the beginning of the story, step by step. Step by step. I don't want any memorization. I just want you to understand. Step by step. What's the next logical question you have about ATP synthase? What's the next logical thing you want to figure out about it?
What makes it spin?
What makes it
Spin.
What makes it spin, right? Yeah. Think about it. It's spinning, right? And the spinning allows it to make ATP. But do you think it's spinning for free?
No.
No, because making ATP can't be free. If breaking down ATP releases so much energy, that's exergonic, right? Well, then making ATP is the opposite. It can't be free. That's endergonic. It's not free. So what you should understand is, this guy's not spinning for free and just making ATP. If this thing could spin for free and make ATP, you wouldn't need sugar. You don't need sugar. You eat any sugar or fat. You wouldn't need to get any energy in your food. You know what I mean? If it spun for free, you wouldn't need any kind of
That means the energy.
calories. Yeah. So now the question is, why is this thing spinning? Like, what's pushing it to spin, right? And here's what it is. Here it is. Ready for this? You see this space? What's this space? Intermembrane space. There's a whole lot of protons here. Look, there's a bunch. H plus. Look, a bunch of protons. H plus, H plus, H plus, H plus. There's a whole bunch of protons in here. So the way you say a whole bunch, a high concentration of something, the way you say that is, you put brackets like this. See these brackets? The brackets mean concentration, and there's a high concentration of protons, right? So you put an up arrow, you see? There's a high concentration of protons here in the intermembrane space. So what does that mean? There's a whole lot of protons in the intermembrane space. And just to remind you, do you guys remember? If you have hydrogen, H, what is the hydrogen made out of?
Proton.
A proton, right? The hydrogen is made out of a H plus, which equals proton, which means
One electron.
hydrogen ion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
A proton is H plus, is hydrogen ion. All three of these things literally mean the same thing. And what else is a hydrogen made out of?
Oh, wait.
No, the hydrogen. One proton and one,
OH.
no, that's water. Just the
Electron.
Electron, right? One electron. Anyway, a hydrogen is a proton and an electron, right? And proton, you can write it as H plus, is what I'm saying. And look, there's a whole bunch of protons in the intermembrane space, right? Now what you should realize is there's also protons in the matrix here, okay? There are protons here, but not nearly as much. Does that make sense? There are protons here, but there are many more protons. There's much higher concentration protons there. Does that make sense? So what do? I draw a little bracket. That means concentration of protons is down. It's low. So in the matrix, the concentration of protons is really low. In the intermembrane space, the concentration of protons is relatively high. Right? Does that make sense? So what do these protons want to do then?
Move inside.
Move it? Can they go through the membrane directly?
No.
No, because they're charged. Remember,
have the
charged
charge?
things can't go through the membrane directly. But here's the thing. ATP
ATP.
synthase. ATP synthase will allow you, it says come on in, right? But
The glucose go with
you have to push the wheel. This is the
Okay.
thing. Look, the proton will attach to this wheel and it will literally push the wheel around and then come in. And now the proton came in, you see? So the ATP synthase is not only an enzyme that makes ATP, it's also a carrier. Remember carrier transporter?
Yeah.
It'll allow the proton to cross, but not for free. It says, okay, you can come in, but you have to spin this turbine. You have to spin this motor. Do you remember that this is diffusion of protons, right?
Yeah.
Diffusion of protons.
Too low.
Do you remember that diffusion is a spontaneous process?
Yeah.
Yes.
And spontaneous means release
Release
energy,
energy.
right? There you go. There's diffusion of protons, and that's releasing the energy. The energy is being used to spin the thing, to spin the motor, right? And remember energy coupling? We talked about energy coupling. You can use the energy released by a spontaneous thing to power a non-spontaneous thing, right? Does that make sense? Look, the spontaneous thing that's happening is what? Protons are diffusing in, right? That's releasing the energy you need to spin the wheel and power
To make ADP.
to make ATP. Does that make sense? So you're asking, where did the energy come from to spin this thing and make ATP? From the diffusion of protons. Because diffusion is a spontaneous process, and anything spontaneous releases energy that you could use to do work. Yeah, isn't that interesting? So you're using the power released from diffusion of protons to do the work of spinning the ATP synthase and to make ATP, to allow the ATP to be made. If there was no diffusion, then the wheel would stop spinning. You don't have power to make ATP. Does that make sense? Great. Yes.
So when the concentration in the inter equal with the concentration in the matrix, so that will be stopped right there.
That's right. Yeah. So her question was,
Where?
well, what happens if the concentration of protons here equals out? You know, because look what the protons are doing. The protons keep coming in. At some point,
Yeah.
it's going to be equal concentration of protons, right? That's equilibrium. And then is this going to spin anymore?
No speed.
No, and that's not good, right? That's not good.
No good.
So you know what the next good question is then?
Where?
How
In that
can
case, where are these protons coming
Where we
from,
down?
Yeah.
right? Because you're not just born with an infinite amount of protons here. Does that make sense? So something must be putting all these protons in here. Does that make sense? Otherwise, they're going to push this, they're going to come in, and you're going to reach equilibrium at some point. Does that make sense? So something must be like actively putting protons in here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And here's what. That's exactly right. Look. I did warn you that you will be erasing. Maybe I'll do these ones in blue. Here's some more transmembrane. Oh no, blue is not working.
Green.
I'll just do it. It's fine. Okay, so here's another transmembrane protein complex. Here's another transmembrane protein complex. This one is not transmembrane, notice that,
Yeah.
but it's part of this whole deal. And this is another transmembrane protein complex. This one's called 1. This one's called 2. This one's called 3. And this one is called 4. Complex 1, 2, 3, 4. 3 of them are transmembrane. That means they span the whole membrane. One of them is not, but it's part of this whole process. I'll explain why it's part of the process in a second. So here's the thing. 1, 3, and 4, the transmembrane ones, are pumps. They are pumps. And you know what they pump? Protons. Yeah. They take H+, because remember I did say there is some H+ in the matrix, it just isn't as much, right? They take H+ from the matrix and they literally That's what they do, is they pump it out. There you go. You pump the proton this way. And this one does the same thing. Look, it takes a proton and it pumps it out into the intermembrane. And by out, I mean into the intermembrane space, from the matrix to the intermembrane space. And these pumps are powerful. These powerful pumps are pumping protons. That's their job. These pumps are just pumping protons into the intermembrane space, and that's all they do, right? Can you see how if you have 3 powerful pumps just pumping protons here, that's why you would get a high concentration of protons here? Because they're constantly taking the protons from here and jamming them up into here.
So they do work too?
They have to be doing work, right? Is that passive transport? Is that diffusion? If you're jamming some protons from here and making a high concentration of protons, no, that's against diffusion, right? That's not diffusion, that's not passive, that's active transport. So what you should realize is something must be powering these pumps, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
ATP.
something, is it ATP?
ATP.
That's a good guess, it's not ATP. It's not ATP, but that's a very good guess, because usually ATP powers pumps like this. Usually ATP does this.
The energy.
But it's not ATP. Here's what it is. You guys ready to figure out what it is? It's not ATP, but it's very interesting what it is. Here's how it works. These complexes, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and there's other stuff in here which I'm not going to mention. There's something between 1 and 2, there's something between 3 and 4. I'm not going to mention those. Just ignore those for now. I'm going to draw some green dots, okay? I'm just drawing these green dots in here. And these green dots are part of the complexes. 1, 2, 3, and 4. You see those green dots I drew? Those are part of complex 1, part of complex 2, 3, and 4. But those green dots are cofactors.
Oh,
Okay, cofactors. You guys remember cofactors?
yeah.
Cofactors help proteins or enzymes work. It could be iron, and actually a lot of these green dots have iron in them. Iron, sulfur, other minerals. There are minerals inside of the green dots, okay? And here's the special thing about the green dots. The green dots, like electrons, they're electronegative. Remember what electronegative means? Like affinity for electrons, right? Affinity for electrons. So the green dots are designed to accept electrons. Like, I'll take an electron. But here's the thing. This is what you need to understand. This cofactor is the least electronegative. It wants the electrons the least. This one wants it more. This one wants it more. This one wants it more. This one wants it even more. More. Most. You see that? So, here's the thing. You can feed this machine, and by machine I say 1, 2, 3, 4. You can feed it electrons. You can give it electrons, and you can give it electrons here. You can give that cofactor an electron, or here. This is the other place you can give it an electron. You see that? What do you think happens to those electrons once you give them to the machine?
They keep it.
They keep what?
They keep the electron.
So this cofactor gets the electron, yeah. But remember I said its neighbor is even greedier. So what's
Oh, so they bond.
No, they pull.
No, they pull
pull the what?
that one
Pull this electron. So the electron hops here,
and then hop up.
and then hops there, and then hops here and joins this one, and they hop here, you see?
Giống như the
Oh, they
pole.
created.
Like a wire, you know, like a wire? You see, like this, look, check this out. So, you see this rectangular table in front of me, this table right here, right? This table. Imagine if this table was made out of piano keys, you know, like a piano? Okay, piano. Imagine if this piano key is a weak magnet, right? Then the piano key next to it is a stronger magnet. Then the piano key next to it is a stronger magnet, and a stronger magnet, and the strongest magnet's over here. What happens when I put a magnetic ball here and let go? The ball will go toward the strongest magnet. Is that spontaneous? Yeah, does that make sense?
It is.
So just like the ball will go toward the strongest magnet spontaneously, if I feed, you feed this thing electrons, kind of like you feed coins into a vending machine, like if I want a soda, I can put coins in the vending machine, the coins go on a journey, you know what I mean? Same thing here, I can feed electron coins, I can feed electrons into this machine, and those electrons go on a journey, right? Does that make sense? So if I give this cofactor an electron, it's like giving that magnet a ball. The electron hops to the next cofactor, hops to the next cofactor, because as you go this way, they're more and more electronegative. They're more and more greedy. And that's the greediest one right there. That's the greediest one. And this one's the least greedy one, and it increases in greediness that way. And of course, it's not magnetic force that's pulling those electrons. It's electronegativity that's pulling those electrons. And are those electrons moving through spontaneously?
Yes.
Yes. They're moving through for free, aren't they? Yeah, just because this is greedier, so the electron's gonna jump to there. It's just greedier, right? Does that make sense? So, is that a spontaneous process?
Yes.
The electrons moving? Yeah. Do spontaneous things release energy?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you use that energy to do work?
Yes.
Yes. What is the work?
Yeah, pump.
Pump the
Pump
protons.
out.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Complex 1, 2, 3, and 4 behave like a wire. Like a wire. Like your electronics. Your electronics, the electrons go through the wires.
Oh.
This is like a wire.
It's
Like
like,
a biological-
electricity. Like
Electricity, yeah, it's like electricity. It's like a biological wire. Isn't that interesting? It's like a biological wire. Even though this complex is not connected to that complex, and this one's not connected to that one, the electrons can move from complex to complex. It's really amazing, right? So again, the spontaneous movement of electrons releases the energy you need to pump the protons. That's how you're powering the pumps to do active transport of protons. Isn't that interesting? It's really fascinating, really. Because remember, energy coupling. You can use the energy released from a spontaneous reaction to power the non-spontaneous. Here, the energy released is the electrons flowing to power the protons pumping. Here, the energy is diffusion of protons to make the ATP. You see, every time you're using something spontaneous to provide the energy for something that's not spontaneous. And by the way, complex 1, 2, 3, and 4, they have a name. Anyone know the name of complex 1, 2, 3, and 4? Together they have a name. It's actually kind of a silly name, and I'll explain why in a second. The name of complex 1, 2, 3, and 4 is the electron transport chain. ETC. The electron transport chain. ETC. Okay? The electron transport chain. But is that a good name? I don't think that's a good name. You know why? Is it transporting electrons?
No.
It helps.
No, it's transporting protons. It's just the electrons power it. Does that make sense? I don't think that's the greatest name for the thing, but that's what they call the thing. The electron transport chain. Why? Because electrons flow. That provides the energy to do their real job. Your real job is to pump the protons. Pump the protons, right? It's kind of a silly name. It's kind of like calling a car, if you have an automobile, it's like calling the car a fuel guzzler, you know? It's like, I guess it does guzzle fuel, but that's not its job. So, yes?
So, like, as the electrons moving through the enzymes, it's still pushing the proton up.
Yes, yes. As the electrons move through these complexes, that's you giving those complexes the power to push those protons. Yeah, exactly right. And the minute you stop giving those electrons to this chain, that's going to stop pumping, and then
Stop
you
the
could reach
spinning.
equilibrium, stop the spinning.
Uh-huh.
So you've got to have a constant stream of electrons.
electron
You have to
in
keep
and
feeding the
outside.
machine. When you run out of coins, electron coins, then you run out. You run out of this machine, right? This machine stops working. Interesting.
So where do you get the electron from?
Is what?
Where do you get the
Next step,
electron
where
from?
the electron.
Where do you get the electrons from?
Yes.
Exactly. Where do we get these electrons from and these protons
From-
from? Where do we get these electrons? Mainly the electrons, right? But also the protons. Where do we get them from? So check this out. Check this out. The sugars you ate, right?
Yeah.
The sugars you're eating in your diet. It's made out of C's, H's, and O's.
Ratio 1 to 1.
Yeah, 1 to 2 to 1. What do you have the most of? C's, H's, or O's?
H.
H's. And what do you need to power this machine?
Oh,
Protons
Protons
and
and
electrons, which means
H.
H's.
Okay.
You guys follow this?
Got it.
And what about fats? You remember fats? It kind of looks like this.
Oh, fatty acid.
Yeah.
What's made out of those H?
You remember the fatty acid tails?
Yeah.
What are the fatty acid tails made out of?
All the carbon and
Carbon and 2
And
hydrogens.
two hydrogen.
Can you imagine how many hydrogens are on fatty acid tails?
More than
No.
fat.
A lot.
It's a lot.
At either dozens or hundreds, right?
Oh, okay.
So do you see? You could take all these little hydrogens from the fat and use it to power the machine. You see what I'm saying? Or you can take the hydrogens from the sugar and use it to power the machine. Does that make sense? The machine runs on hydrogen, doesn't it? Because it runs on protons and it runs on electrons. What are you getting from your sugars and your fats? A ton of hydrogens, right? Does that make sense? And does it make sense why fats give you more energy than sugar?
Yeah.
Look
The
how
more
many hydrogens.
hydrogen, free
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, do you know how much, if I had a fat molecule, you know how much longer I could run this machine than if I had a sugar molecule?
Forever.
Much longer, because there's like so many hydrogens on a fat.
Got it.
Too
Isn't
much
that
fat,
interesting? Isn't that interesting? That's why fats give you so much energy. And it takes so much effort to burn the fats because, man, you're producing tons of ATP per fat molecule, right? Cool. So do you know what this cellular respiration is then? When we eat sugars and fats, we're trying to take all of those H's, which are protons and electrons, take all of these H's away so we can give those H's to
The mitochondria.
this machine, right? The mitochondria, this machine eats the H's,
Yeah.
right? Does that make sense? Now, listen to this. What happens if you take C, H, and O and take all of its H's away so you can put it into that machine? What's left?
C and O.
C and O, CO2.
The second law.
The leftover.
That's the leftover
Let the
junk.
leftover from
You
the
breathe it out.
glucose.
See that?
Yeah,
You breathe out CO2, right?
the disorder.
Yeah, and increase disorder. There you go.
Yeah.
You just increase disorder. Sure. This is a very organized 6-carbon molecule. You just made 6 little molecules. You increase disorder. That's a good point. But you see, you always knew you breathe out CO2, right? But you don't know why. Now you know why.
Now you know how.
You know
Leftover
why?
from the
It's the
glucose.
leftover from the sugars and the fats. It's the leftover of the sugars
Because
and
they
the
have
fats.
to take the H to make ATP.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So the leftover.
Now, this will blow your minds. You guys ready to have your minds blown?
Yeah.
Okay? Listen to this. When you're breathing out that CO2, it used to be the sugars and the
Sugar
fats
and the-
in your body. Those sugars and fats in your body weighed your body down. They gave you your weight when you step on the scale and you're like, oh man,
Oh.
right?
Uh-huh.
So how are you losing that weight?
You exercise.
No, you treat it more.
You breathe it out.
Breathe it out more.
Isn't that funny? You lose weight by breathing it out.
Well,
You get weight, yeah, that's true.
Yes. But think about it. The CO2 you're breathing out, those were the C's and the O's of the sugars and the fats that were weighing you down.
Oh, that's why when you exercise, you breathe in and out. That's why
When
they
you're,
burn.
when you're
they burn your
exercising
leftover.
hard, you're breathing hard, so you're getting rid of more CO2, that means you're getting rid of more sugars and fats.
That means
Now,
use more
keep in
ATP.
mind, you also produce some water during this, so not 100% of your weight is lost through your mouth, but some of this water does come out of your lungs, and then you also pee, urinate the water. So
And sweat.
when it's sweat and urination and breathing, and also CO2, you actually lose weight through the exhale when you leave, Now you can't just sit there and breathe really fast, that doesn't, you have to actually produce more CO2. You know how you produce more CO2? If you want to produce more CO2,
Take more.
exercise.
You exercise, you run.
Exercise, right.
You run.
When you exercise, especially aerobic exercise, your body suddenly needs more ATP,
ATP.
so it starts burning more sugars and fats, producing more CO2. You start breathing out more CO2, you're losing weight.
Yeah, but you increase more disorder.
But then you go and get a pizza for dinner, you just got more sugars and fats, you started it all over again, So, it's pretty interesting stuff. So this is called the electron transport chain for that reason. Okay, and what about this? So the electrons go down, and then the electrons stick here, right?
Yeah.
Do you see a problem with that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
You
so
can't
loud.
stay there forever.
Yeah, so the electron's stuck here. What about the next electron's gonna get stuck there? The next electron's gonna get stuck there, and pretty soon you're gonna have a traffic jam.
Yeah,
Like
traffic jam.
like 75 freeway on a bad day. The whole thing's gonna be traffic jam, and you shut down the whole, freeway, right? Does that make sense? So here's the thing. Something needs to come along
And grab.
at the end of the ride and take the electrons off of the ride, right? And this something needs to be very electronegative, right? Because this is greedy, right? This little dot, this little cofactor is very greedy, it's very electronegative.
You cannot take it.
Yeah, it's hard to take it from it, but something can. What do you think comes along and takes the electrons off of the ride at the end? It has to be very electronegative, it has to be very oxidative.
Iron.
Oxygen. Oxygen.
Fluorine?
What did you say?
Oxygen? O2?
O2.
O2, the oxygen.
Remember on the
Yeah,
periodic
higher,
table of elements, on the table of elements?
Yeah.
Oxygen's right at the top right,
Yeah.
close to the top right. It's super greedy for electrons, isn't it? And is it required for this process?
Yeah.
Look at this. Look at that. You require oxygen. So you know what happens at the end of the ride?
Oxygen. Take.
They call it 1/2 O2. I don't know why.
Is that O?
1/2 O2 is just O. O comes along. O picks up 2 electrons, and it also picks up 2 protons. And what does O become when it picks up 2 electrons and 2 protons? Water. Water. Look at this. Water.
Oh, explain why you release water. You pee and you
Yeah,
sweat.
you sweat, you pee, but also your lungs can release water. Have you ever held glass to your mouth and,
Yeah.
Oh, I see it. I
and
saw
it's
the
all
steam
steamy and moist?
blurring.
So when you do cellular respiration, your two waste products are CO2, which you breathe out, and water. Some of it you breathe out, some of you sweat, some of it you urinate. But when you're losing weight, that's how you're losing the weight. The C's and the O's are leaving through your lungs, so you're losing a majority of the weight through just your lungs, and then some of it through other means as well. But isn't that interesting?
Mhm.
And so this oxygen is called the terminal electron acceptor. Terminal means final or last, right?
Mhm.
It's the last electron acceptor. It makes sense. Look, it picks up the electron at the end, right?
Mhm.
It picks up the electron. So oxygen, is it getting oxidized to H2O or reduced to H2O?
Gain.
It's gaining an electron, so it's getting reduced,
Reduce.
right? Oxygen is becoming reduced to H2O. Oxygen is picking up those electrons and a couple protons and becoming H2O. And here's something else that's going to blow your mind. You ready to have your mind blown again? All right? Think about this for a second.
Hold on.
Think about this for a second.
tomorrow, I forgot.
You have lungs, right? You're sitting there, you're breathing. You've been breathing since you were born.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, you've been breathing since you were born. You can't not breathe for very long anyway. Why are you breathing? Why do you have to breathe?
Because you need it.
You need the
You need it to
O2.
make
You need the
ATP.
O2.
You need the oxygen. When you breathe in, you need the oxygen because you need a terminal electron acceptor. And when you breathe out, you're getting rid of CO2 because one of the products is carbon dioxide. That's the product of glucose
Yeah,
and
glucose.
fat, right?
The leftover glucose.
So if you're wondering, like, why do I need to know about cellular respiration? Like, why is that important to know this? It's literally why you're breathing right now. Like, there's no other reason you need to breathe. Because you might think, well, maybe there's other things in my body that I need to be breathing for. Not really. You need the oxygen because you need a terminal electron acceptor right here to pick up the electrons at the end of this ride. If you didn't need a terminal electron acceptor,
You don't breathe.
then you wouldn't need to breathe in. And to breathe out, if you didn't produce CO2 because of this, you wouldn't need to breathe out either. So you wouldn't
So don't
need
need the
lungs, you wouldn't need
respiration.
lungs, you wouldn't need respiration, real respiration. So cellular respiration is the reason you need real respiration, which
how
is,
I need,
So
you know,
breathe.
breathing.
and how you
Yeah.
exchange the,
Yes,
the air with
Exactly.
the environment.
it's literally why you're breathing. It is literally why you are breathing right now, right? Is cellular respiration. It's because you need ATP. Without ATP, think about it. If you can't make ATP, then anything in the cell that needs to happen can't happen, right? That requires energy. Remember all those endergonic reactions in the cell? There's many of them. Every time a cell wants to do something, it needs energy. It's like, where's my ATP? You don't provide it with ATP, you can't do those things. Your heart stops, you die, your brain stops. You need ATP to keep living. And the reason you're sitting there breathing and the reason you can't hold your breath too long is because cellular respiration needs to be going. You know what I mean? All the time. So now we've explained the majority of the ATP, right? 28 of these. We've talked about why you get water. We've talked about why you get CO2. We've talked about why you need oxygen. We've talked about why you need glucose or fat, right? Because it's the source of those hydrogen. By the way, is glucose getting reduced to CO2 or oxidized to CO2? Oxidized. Remember, oxidized means loss of electron is oxidized. What are we doing to the glucose? We are taking its electrons, right? We are also taking its protons, but you don't have to worry about that. We're mainly talking about the electrons. We're taking its H's, right? H's include electrons. So we are oxidizing. Glucose gets oxidized to CO2. Oxygen gets
Reduced to water.
And listen to this. These electrons that started on the glucose and the fat, these electrons that started on glucose and fat, they're the ones that end up on oxygen to make water. Isn't that interesting? So cellular respiration is the story of the electrons, right? The story of the electrons. It started on the glucose or the fat. It made its way to this machine. It ended on oxygen to make water. The electron started on the sugar or the fat. It ended on the oxygen to make water. And the journey in the middle of those electrons is how we made ATP, by moving those electrons around to power these machines and stuff. Interesting, right? So this is called step 3. This is part 3 of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is 3 parts. This is part 3. So I'm going to write, part 3.
Oh my God, look at 3.
Yeah, this is part 3.
Oh my God, 2 more parts.
This is the third and final part. Remember I said I would start at the end, right? And the third part is called oxidative phosphorylation.
Is it the hardest part or is it the
Phosphorylate.
easiest part?
Is it the hardest part or the easiest part? Well, I think it's the most.
Easiest one.
I think it's the easiest. Well, because
Okay. Good to know.
no. I mean, I think if I had started at step 1 or part 1, you'd be very confused.
Oh,
And that's why I start on part 3. No one starts on part 3. This is what I came up with myself. I didn't learn it this way. I didn't find it this way. I don't think you're going to find it anywhere like this. But the reason I teach it backwards is because of this. Watch. I haven't even told you about part 1, part 1.5. There's actually a part 1.5.
oh, gee.
Or part 2, right? There's part 1, right? Part 1,
1.5.
part 1.5,
2.
and part 2.
2.5.
I haven't even told you what those parts do, right?
Mhm.
But what do you think they do?
Oh, each part, right?
Huh?
Talk about each one and combine the end.
Yeah, this is what you're trying to achieve at the end. But what do you think the point of the first couple of parts is?
Focus on each one.
Focus? No? What do you think of the main point of part 1, part 1.5, part 2?
How did the glucose get inside the
Glucose, what is
mitochondria?
glucose?
The glucose, what happens to the glucose? Yeah, you're going to start with glucose
All fat.
in the mitochondria or something, and then what are you going to do to that glucose? Huh?
Process it.
Process it? Yeah, process it. How?
Break it down.
Break it down, take its H's.
Yeah.
Right, does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
So I'm gonna take glucose or fat or whatever, but we're talking about glucose. I'm gonna take glucose and I'm gonna take its H's away, aren't I? Why do I wanna take its H's?
Because we need the.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I can
yeah.
put it into this machine and it powers the whole machine.
Yeah.
Without those H's, this machine's nothing, right?
Yeah.
So the point, see, that's why I explained 3 first. Because it makes sense of 1, 1.5, and 2. So what's happening during 1, 1.5, and 2? You're processing your glucose. You're basically taking many, many steps. It actually takes many, many steps, many, many different enzymes, doing many, many steps before you've taken all of these H's and you're ready to put them in here. Does that make sense? So the main point of step 1, of part 1, part 1.5, part 2, is to fully oxidize the glucose to CO2 so that you can take all the H's and put them into this machine, right? Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
So now when I teach you about part 1, part 1.5, part 2, you're not like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? It's like, remember, the main point is to get its H's and to give the H's to the machine. So you're less likely to get confused. But the thing is, if you don't even know what the machine is, and I start with part 1 and I say, look, we're taking glucose and we're breaking it and we're gonna take its H's, and you're like, huh? Why are we doing all this stuff? Why are we messing with glucose, you know? And then at the end, I'm like, but because there's this machine that spins, and it's like, oh, you know, I prefer to tell you about the machine that spins first, and then tell you about how we process the fuel, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's kind of like a car, right? Imagine this. Imagine if you had a friend, and your friend has never seen a car, right? Never seen a car. Lived on an island. Never seen a car, ever. And they ask you,
What is a car?
what's a car? What's a car?
What is that for?
Yeah, what's a car? You would say, well, a car is a box with wheels. Basically, you can get in and it takes you around, you know? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And then
That's like talking about the little ATP synthase. It's a little thing that spins and makes ATP. You know, it's pretty straightforward, right? Now, if you told your friend who'd never seen a car, and this is how you explained a car, you're like, well, here's what you do. You get 87 octane, okay? You get 87 octane out the pump, and you're gonna pump it into the fuel tank, all right? And then in the fuel tank, there's gonna be a fuel pump, and it's gonna pump the fuel to this pistons. Then there's a spark plug in there that's gonna explode, and there's gonna be a big combustion, and that's gonna drive the piston out the camshaft, or the you know, and you go off, like, is anyone knowing what you're talking about?
No.
No, because they've not even seen the
They
car.
don't know the car.
They don't even know the car, and you're talking about the fuel? You know, like, why would you talk about the
Like
fuel
right
before
now,
you
you
talk
talk
about the
about
car?
a car, I have no idea. Oh,
Right, exactly.
What is piston?
Yeah, what is a piston even? And that's what I'm talking about. Explaining cellular respiration starting with part 1 is like explaining to your friend what a car is starting with the fuel and what the fuel is doing. It's like, why would you tell me what the fuel is doing first? Why wouldn't you just say it's a neat little machine that spins and makes ATP? And now we gotta figure out how to power this thing, you know? Because now it's like, oh yeah, I understand why you're trying to take those H's. I understand why you're trying to get those H's away from the glucose, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good. Awesome. Any questions? Let me check on this thing, see if it's still, I think it's still going. Yeah. Any questions about it so far? Yes.
For the terminal electron acceptor, is
Yeah.
that the name it gets when it's in the mitochondria?
The terminal electron acceptor is anything that comes along and picks up the electrons at the end of this particular run
Okay.
from
so-
complex 4. So here's the thing, humans, for us humans, our terminal electron acceptor is oxygen. No ifs, ands, or buts, right? In other organisms, it could be something other than oxygen, like sulfate or usually like microorganisms, like prokaryotes. Some bacteria, some bacteria live where there's no oxygen at all. In fact, oxygen might kill them. Those creatures might use like a nitrogen-containing molecule, like a nitrate or something, or deep sea, or a sulfate or something with sulfur in it or nitrogen in it, something other than oxygen. But that's not us. Our terminal electron acceptor is oxygen.
So
Yeah,
have to
that
be,
doesn't mean every creature on Earth that's their terminal electron acceptor, because some creatures breathe stuff other than oxygen. Yeah.
Fish.
so have to be higher negative activity than
Yes,
the
yes.
hydrogen.
Those creatures that use something other than oxygen,
Oxygen.
they still use something that's greedy, something that's electronegative, but it's just not oxygen. Yeah, very good. And here's one more thing to understand. Part 1, I'm going to give you the name of part 1. Part 1 is called glycolysis. Part 1.5 is called oxidation of pyruvate. Part 2 is called the Krebs cycle. Pyruvate. Part 1 is called glycolysis. Part 1.5 is called oxidation of pyruvate. And part 2 is called the Krebs cycle. And the one I explained just now was part 3, oxidative phosphorylation. That's also the name of how you make these 28 ATP. These 28 ATP you made, they say you made it by oxidative phosphorylation, which means you make these ATP by this process of oxidative phosphorylation. And there's one last thing we need to talk about. Let me make sure everything is good. Oh, please go back. Okay. Yeah, it's going. All right, so again, we've got 3 parts, 3.5 parts, I guess you could call it. And there's one last thing to talk about, and that is how do the H's go from there to there, right?
Mhm.
There are 2 little molecules called electron carriers, and the electron carriers are called NAD+ or FAD. Those NAD+ or FAD are the electron carriers. Can you see them on there? Yeah. Do you know what these are? These are small electron carriers. Nicotinamide, you don't need to know this, nicotinamide adenosine dinucleotide and flavin adenosine dinucleotide. They're dinucleotides. What's a nucleotide? Remember, it's a building block of DNA or RNA? This is a dinucleotide. So it's just two nucleotides, but their job isn't to make DNA or RNA. Their job is to go over here, grab H's, go over here and drop them off, right? So when they go over here,
Like a UPS.
like UPS. Yeah. When they go over here, NAD+ picks up 2 electrons and a proton, and it becomes, you know what it becomes? NADH. Does that make sense? No, just NADH. FAD goes over here to these previous steps, picks up 2 electrons and 2 protons to become FADH2. Okay? So these H's are the H's from the sugar or the fat. Yeah, the sugar, yeah. And then the the NADH drops off here, look. NADH drops off the H here at complex 1. The electrons go into the machine, the H's pop off into the matrix, and then they can get pumped out. FADH2 drops off
Electron.
at complex 2. Does that make sense? NADH drops off the H here at complex 1. FADH2 drops off here at complex 2. And where do you make these NADH and FADH2? In the part 1 and a half, part 2. That's where they pick up the electrons. That's where they pick up the H's, right? And then once they drop off, then they become NAD plus again and FAD again, right?
And then they go back.
And they, like a UPS service, they can go back,
More.
get more, and keep coming back. So the electron carriers, their job is to come here, pick up those H's,
Drop out.
come here, drop them off, go back here, pick up H's, come here, and drop them off,
Ship
and
it
then do
again.
that over and over and over again. And we're done, right? Any questions? Yes,
We don't need to know that, right? The NADH.
we do.
We do.
It's very unfortunate, but we do. Yeah. And I think I will end it here so it's not too long.
Think about
Oh no, it's a bit long.